The ACC has released their full college football schedule for 2025. The ACC is a little slow, but now we've got it. So let's jump right into Clemson's schedule. And the opener is the most interesting game, maybe the most interesting game they've had for a while, with LSU coming to Clemson's Death Valley. The Tigers of the Bayou Tigers and the Clemson Tigers have played a couple times recently, but there's definitely a freshness to it because they played in the national championship game in 2019. Joe Burrow, one of the greatest teams of all time, beating Clemson. And then they played in that 2012 Chick-fil-A Bowl with the Chandler Catanzaro walk-off kick, sort of springboarded Clemson to kind of start being great. That was huge for the Dabo Swinney era, really kicking off and starting to pick up those big wins. But they're not teams that play all the time. Clemson, Notre Dame have been playing a lot as part of the Notre Dame agreement with the ACC. And I don't know if it's stale, but it's getting a little stale. Georgia Clemson's obviously a great rivalry, more local than LSU, but some of those games were in neutral sites. And quite frankly, Georgia wins almost all of those games. Clemson has a really bad record against Georgia, so kind of sick of playing them. I think this LSU matchup is one of the most entertaining. I think it'll be a night game because you got Ohio State hosting Texas that week. That's probably a Fox noon game. That opening week's going to be great, and we'll see if it's a night game. The night game in Clemson's Death Valley would be a lot of fun, but honestly, anything but a noon game would be pretty awesome, and I think we're pretty likely to get that. Both of these teams should be ranked fairly highly, and I think Clemson will be top 10 in the early rankings. Before I move on from that, I think it's worth mentioning, LSU, huge brand, going to come to Clemson. They lost 5 straight season openers. They lost to Mississippi State in 2020. They lost to UCLA in 2021. They lost to Florida State in 22 and 23. And this past year, they lost to Southern Cal. So kind of surprising. Certainly not what you would expect. Nonetheless, they were still very good last year. They only lost 3 games after that season opening loss to Southern Cal, losing 3 in a row at Texas A&M, Alabama, and at Florida. But beyond that, they were perfect. The 9-4, still a good team, play a tough schedule. It'll be big time game, big time brand. So that's a fun one. After that, Clemson will host Troy. They've only played Troy twice. Nothing too interesting, honestly, there. They played twice, but the last one was in 2016 where Clemson struggled, only got a 6-point win. Of course, they went on to win the national championship that year. Troy's not good. As you can see from this graphic here, they were 4-8 last year. So they're a Sun Belt team, which isn't the worst conference, but they're not a good Sun Belt team. Just, not the most interesting game there. But then after that, they go on the road. Clemson goes on the road to Atlanta to face Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was 7-6 last year, kind of ended with a little bit of a fizzle. But they were really physical throughout the year. They looked much improved. They took Georgia to the Y. So they're a tough team, and they've got a lot of talent coming back. They've got Haynes King at quarterback, who was injured for chunks of the year, but was dynamic, a great runner. Won't be easy with him. And they bring back Jamal Haynes, a running back, who's another really good player that's going to give anyone fits. Right, pretty early, Clemson's going to find out if they fix that run defense. If not, Georgia Tech and Jamal Haynes will run all over them. And then they also get their star defensive player, Kyle Efford, back, the linebacker. So they've got a good team. They're really building something there. It's going to be in Atlanta. Clemson's still more talented. Clemson should still win, but that's going to be a test. That's going to be a physical team that is good, but maybe won't post big win totals because their schedule's so tough. Georgia Tech opens the year against Colorado. Now, Colorado loses a ton. I think Georgia Tech should be better than them. But they go on the road, beat Colorado. They come home, they beat Gardner-Webb. Then they'll host Clemson. So if they're 2-0, if Clemson beats LSU and Clemson's 2-0, that could be a pretty big game that gets a lot of attention. So I think that's another really intriguing game on the schedule. They didn't play last year for the first time in forever because the expanded ACC left Clemson with only one annual rival in the conference, which is Florida State, which I think is a real shame. I think Georgia Tech's the team that needs to be a permanent rival. They're so close, 2 hours away, long history. Frankly, if I had to pick, I'd pick Georgia Tech, but I don't know that Georgia Tech wants that. So good to have them back on the schedule. After that, Clemson has one more game before their first bye. They play Syracuse. They went 10-3 last year. They were excellent, They relied really heavily on their quarterback, Kyle McCord, who they very wisely brought in. Ohio State, in fairness to them, wisely decided to move on, figured he wasn't the best fit. They went and got Howard from Kansas State. Obviously, they went and won a national championship with Howard. Well, Kyle McCord went and put up 4,700 passing yards at Syracuse. He was amazing. But he's off to the NFL. And LaQuint Allen, who had over 1,000 rushing yards, he's also off to the NFL. And Jackson Meeks, their wide receiver, who was a transfer, he had 1,000 receiving yards. He's off to the NFL. And Aronde Gadsden, who had 934 receiving yards, one of the best tight ends, he's off to the NFL. So this offense is going to take a big step back. I actually think this is Clemson, will end up being one of Clemson's less interesting games. They just got a ton to replace, and I just don't think they'll be quite the same. After that, Clemson goes on a bye week before back-to-back road games. I'm going to pause right now and just remind you, if you haven't already, please like this video. It really helps it get out there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. All right. So they take that first bye and really don't love Clemson coming off byes. They've last couple of years really struggled after the bye or after their open date. And maybe that's different now with Tom Allen coming in as defensive coordinator. I think struggling after an open date is a negative. It's a bad look for the coaching staff, right? You had the extra time and you did not prepare them. You did not use that time effectively. It backfired. It's a bad mark on the coaching staff. I think this is a good coaching staff, and maybe we'll see that change. But Clemson goes to North Carolina after that open date. So week 6, October 4th, they're in Chapel Hill. UNC was mediocre last year at 6-7. They bring in Bill Belichick, obviously incredible name there. You'd think he'll improve their defense, but I don't know that they have a quarterback. I think Max Johnson maybe is their starter. They also have Ryan Brown, who's a backup for Purdue last year. They've got 2 freshmen that are pretty highly acclaimed who will battle as well. But early in the year, I just don't know that they're going to have things figured out. Belichick will help, but I don't know. I'm not a huge believer in this being an immediate turnaround for UNC, at least not to the point that they're beating a team like Clemson, who I think is going to be really strong this year. So I think Clemson can win that one. And if a QB doesn't emerge, if Max Johnson isn't excellent for them, then that might not be the toughest game. Then Clemson goes on the road again to Boston College. Back-to-back road games, not the easiest thing. But I also think Boston College might not be that great. They certainly weren't great last year, but they were somewhat tough at home. They were 6-1 at home, and they had a couple of those wins were pretty impressive. They include wins over Michigan State, Syracuse, Pittsburgh, and North Carolina. So Boston College, I don't think is going to be that good, but no pushover at home. So those are 2 sort of medium difficulty road games. Probably a good thing those are the road games, and the home games this year tend to be the tougher teams where you really want them at home. Most of all, LSU and SMU. SMU is next. I think it's Clemson's toughest ACC opponent, and they get them at home. I think SMU is probably the second best team in the conference. So, of course, they're Clemson's toughest ACC opponent, right? But they're going to bring back Kevin Jennings, who was an awesome quarterback for them, had a very high PFF grade of 85. And I think it's going to be another battle. Now, SMU does lose Brashard Smith, who ran for 113 yards and caught a touchdown against them. But I think with the investment that the big-time donors at SMU have made, the excitement that's been brought back by being in a real conference and getting real attention and real opponents, and Coach Rhett Lashley, ACC Coach of the Year, put all that together, SMU might be a team that could be towards the top of the conference most of the time. So Clemson should be favored in that game, but that's a game to circle as one of the better games on the schedule for the whole year. Obviously LSU, but beyond that, that's probably the best home game Clemson will have. So that's going to be a tough one, and they get a bye to rest after that, so they can put all their focus on SMU, and then they get a little break. I did mention that Clemson is not typically so good coming out of an open date, and that makes this Duke game scary. Duke is not a hot ticket. They're not a big name, at least not for football, but they've been tricky. They obviously beat Clemson to start the 2023 season, and now they went out and they spent a lot of money on players and bringing in talent. They obviously stole some recruits from Clemson. They also went out and spent $4 million on a new quarterback, bringing in Darian Mensah from Tulane. He was very good last year, posting a PFF grade of 81.7 as a redshirt freshman. Now he's going to come to Duke. They've got Manny Diaz, who's proven to be an impressive coach. This Duke team is another one that if they're going to put all that money in NIL, we'll see how revenue sharing changes things, but they could also be like SMU, one of these private schools where, hey, if you got the money, why can't you compete? Duke's proven they could buy the recruits, they could buy QB transfers. They had a great year. They're well coached. They won 9 games last year, so that's a tricky game. And right after an open date, which is kind of trouble for Clemson, maybe you're riding high or feeling kind of crummy after the SMU game, and then you got Florida State looming, much bigger brand. I think that Duke game's tough, and this is a tough stretch. Really, I think this is the toughest stretch of the year. I think you got SMU, even with the open date, you have SMU, Duke, Florida State, then you go on the road to Louisville. This is going to be a tough finish to the year. So after Duke is Florida State. They were terrible last year, but I don't think they'll be terrible again. They do play Alabama in the opener, and if they get destroyed culturally, I still have a lot of questions about Florida State, which is kind of an ongoing thing with them. Do you believe in their culture? Maybe not, but if things kind of start rolling their way, they can go 13-0, right? Like 2 years ago. I like Gus Malzahn, Tommy Castellanos. I like that combo. That was a combo that started at UCF when Malzahn was the coach there and Castellanos hadn't transferred out yet. I think that duo of having a running quarterback and an offensive coordinator who really thrives with a running quarterback, they're going to definitely unleash Castellanos to run all over the place. I think that gets them going. Now, I don't think they have the talent they had 2 years ago with Keon Coleman and some of those guys, but I don't see them going 2-10. You know, they play Miami early and they play Alabama early, but they should have a pretty strong record coming into that Clemson game, maybe like 6-2 or something along those lines. Their schedule before Clemson is Alabama, probably a loss, East Texas A&M, Kent State, at Virginia, Miami, probably a loss if Carson Beck is as good as he can be, Pitt in Tallahassee, at Stanford, and Wake Forest. Really only 2 of those where you immediately say they'll probably lose. So they could be, that would be 6. Yeah, that would be 6-2. That makes for a good matchup in Death Valley. So I don't know that Florida State has a huge bounce back year. I think they probably 7-5, 8-4 kind of season, regular season. But I think it'll be an interesting matchup that gets attention again and isn't a pushover. But I think the next week's harder when they have to face a Louisville team that finally beat them last year. Louisville had never beat Clemson. They joined the ACC and lost to them every year, often close, but always lost. Last year they came in Death Valley and beat Clemson pretty soundly. I think that's a big credit to Jeff Brom. I think he's a great coach and a great offensive mind. Moving from Purdue to Louisville kind of raises his ceiling. I think the Cardinals, they got to do a better job, and this is to some extent been a problem for Brom always, but you can't beat Clemson and then go lose to Stanford. That's ridiculous. So they got to get better at that consistency. But this is a Friday night game in Louisville against a team that beat you in Clemson last year. They bring back Isaac Brown, the running back who ran for 151 against Clemson. This is another one. This is late in the year, but Tom Allen, you got to fix this run defense or Isaac Brown's going to run all over Clemson, just like they did last year. And I think I have a lot of faith in Tom Allen fixing that, particularly with the way they brought in Will Helt from Purdue from the transfer portal. So I think the defensive end position is better. I also think Tom Allen's going to be a little bit more adaptive to strengths and weaknesses in his roster. But this is going to be tough. Now, Miller Moss comes in from Southern Cal, and he'll be the quarterback at Louisville. And that theoretically is a downgrade, as Tyler Shue had a really impressive 87.4 PFF grade. That's actually not much behind Kate Klubnik. But I kind of credit some of that to excellent offensive mind, Jeff Brom, and I think Moss could be pretty good. So I think this stretch here, SMU, Duke, Florida State, at Louisville, is really tough. I don't know that Clemson wins all of those. Crazy enough, Florida State might be the easiest of those games, and I think they're going to bounce back. I think Duke is good, and they brought in that new quarterback from Tulane. Louisville beat them last year. I think they're good, and that one's a Friday night game at Louisville. I think that's tough. It's also, you have a Friday game, and usually on those weekday games, you want a bye week before it, so you don't have a short week. Maybe not if you're Clemson, but you still don't want a short week. So They got to turn around, travel on the road with one fewer day. I think that Louisville game is really tough. I think it's going to be hard to go 4-0 in that stretch, even with a bye wedged in there. After that, you got Furman. I imagine that's probably Military Appreciation Day, which always makes that game worth going to. Furman wasn't good last year. They were a below average team for the FCS level, just 3-8 as an FCS team playing an FCS schedule. So that's almost a glorified open date. Clemson will have an opportunity to rest guys, which is nice, get healthy. They did that last year though, and then they came out and didn't put up points against South Carolina. So I don't know. Again, with a better coaching staff in place this year, maybe that changes. But of course, it was the offense. They didn't put up too many points against South Carolina after having sort of a rest game. But that's what Furman will be, assuming it's Military Appreciation Day, chance to honor the veterans, have the flyover, the amazing halftime show. That makes it worth going to, of course. But that's more of a rest day because then they go on the road where they've actually performed better than at home against South Carolina. They haven't lost in Columbia since 2013, but they've lost 2 out of 3 Palmetto Bowls, and I think South Carolina could be really good. I mean, they're going to bring back Lenora Sellers, so I'm sure Auburn and many others wanted to poach. They went to the portal. They added NC State's top cornerback in Brandon Siss. They went to the portal again for a running back to replace Rocket Sanders. They got Rasul Faison from Utah State, which doesn't sound great. It sounds, Utah State. He had an 80 PFF grade last year. That's really excellent. That's going to be a tough team, and that's going to be a tough game going on the road. The thing is, it's South Carolina. You don't know if they're really going to live up to the hype at the end of the year. They also don't know if they're going to be healthy. And Clemson seems to do well in Columbia, and I think it's tough for them to win consecutive games against Clemson. Clemson won't be sleeping on that. I tend to think if Clemson's losing a game, it's one of the 4 games in that SMU, Duke, Florida State, Louisville stretch, more so than this one. But if I'm being objective and I'm saying if there's, which is the toughest game on the schedule, it's probably this South Carolina game. If they really live up to the hype, this is the toughest game on the schedule. And that is certainly interesting. You haven't been able to say that in a long time. They're building a pretty decent program down there in the Midlands. And so that'll be an interesting one. But kind of to zoom out and look at the schedule overall, this is a much, much more interesting schedule than last year. Of course, last year we did think the schedule set up to be interesting with road games at Florida State and Virginia Tech. And then both of those teams massively disappointed. We thought that NC State would be a really interesting home game, turned into a blowout, and NC State was pretty bad. Georgia was really good. They disappointed slightly, but I mean, they were really good. I don't think Clemson plays anyone quite at Georgia's level, maybe, which is nice because I think you look at every one of these games and say, Clemson could be favored in every game. There's going to be a lot of games that are, LSU is going to be just a few points. SMU, Duke, Louisville, those could all be close. South Carolina could be really close if Clemson's even favored at all. And Georgia Tech might not be a huge spread. So there's a lot of games here that are going to be interesting, intriguing, and not kind of the blowout fodder we had last year with teams like Virginia and Wake Forest coming into Death Valley. You got almost every game in Death Valley, aside from Troy and Furman, are going to be better than Stanford and Wake Forest and Virginia coming into Death Valley. Syracuse might be the only one where it's early enough that you won't know yet, but I think Syracuse might take a big step back. So maybe you have 3 games in Death Valley that aren't as interesting, Troy, Syracuse, and Furman, but you've got 4 really, really great home games in LSU, SMU, Duke, Florida State. This is a good home schedule. I think it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be really tough to go undefeated, but Clemson should be really good this year. And I think that 11-1, at least in my early look at the schedule, is feasible. And the other thing about having a really tough schedule is if you were to lose, especially if you can beat LSU and South Carolina, sort of make that statement, then if you were to lose, let's say to a good Duke or SMU team and a good Louisville team, and you miss that ACC championship, then maybe you have a chance to sneak in as an at-large. Whereas last year we saw Miami go 10-2, miss that ACC championship game and not get in because their schedule wasn't tough enough. This is a tough schedule, and if you could beat the SEC teams, I think that gives you a little bit more forgiveness if you miss the ACC championship, which with no division, 17 teams, theoretically you could slip up one game, lose to Louisville and maybe SMU, or lose to Louisville, maybe Miami goes undefeated and Louisville just has, let's say, one loss and you lose the tiebreaker, right? So you want a tough schedule where you don't have to win the conference to get in. And I think this is a tough enough schedule that a 10-2 Clemson could get in. But let me know what you think. What game are you most excited about? What road trip is most interesting to you? What game is scariest to you? Leave that in the comments. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It really helps a lot. And I really appreciate it. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for liking these videos, and go Tigers.